is Cyrus Worrells, and I'm Director of Programs at the Institute for Spirituality and Health in the Texas Medical Center. And I see some faces from last week. I also see some new faces. So just for those who are new, the Institute for Spirituality and Health is a 65-year-old nonprofit, part of the Texas Medical Center, one of the early institutions of the medical center. And we began as the first nationally accredited chaplaincy training program. And since then, we've gone through many phases. We were engaged in serious biomedical ethics discussion and research through the 80s. And now we've sort of settled on a university model of research, education, and services. And we offer a great diversity of programming, all towards serving our mission of enhancing well-being by exploring the relationship between spirituality and health. And a lot of times the question we get is, what do you mean by spirituality? Are you, affiliated with a particular church? Or so we are multi-denominational and interfaith, and welcome everyone in whatever way you consider spirituality and what it means to connect and find meaning and purpose in life. So we welcome you all, and I encourage you to check out some of the other programming that we offer. You can explore everything at spiritualityandhealth.org. Right now we're in the midst of our annual celebration called the Caring Hearts Celebration, which is virtual this year. So there's a lot going on right now. We have a virtual auction and all kinds of other things for you to check out. But tonight we're here to continue our journey through Black History Month. And of course, with the events of the past year and the killing of George Floyd, race and racism has been on everyone's minds, and I think for the benefit of all, brought to the forefront of our collective consciousness. And the Institute, as is our way, wanted to offer something unique and contribute uniquely to the conversation. And so Dr. Piercy, we've been blessed to get to know him, and he brings an experiential and a personal and an empathic offering to help us to connect with a felt experience of race, and learn to empathize and understand one another more deeply. So blessed to know Jeremiah, who is a doctor of cognitive psychology and has a breadth of experience leading in stress management and stress management programs, and working with a very diverse population of people, and has 15 years of military service experience as well. So grateful to have you, Dr. Piercy, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, thank you, Cyrus. I appreciate the intro. And yes, please do check out spiritualityandhealth.org if you haven't already. I am very fortunate to have found them and become involved. It's a great organization, and the work that they do is really important, especially during this pandemic and times of racial tension. So please check out their programs, what they offer, and maybe you can join in their midweek meditation or other programs that will help you stay relaxed throughout the week. On that note, as I mentioned previously, this is going to be a continuation of the first week. This week is meant to build on the things that we've already experienced, and to set up for the third week, which will be probably the most tense of all the weeks. So just understand that this is meant to be a journey, a journey for you to experience history in a way that you may have never got the opportunity. So I hope for everyone that you have found a nice, comfortable place where you can relax, and also that your mindset is calm and open, willing to learn and willing to experience things that you may have only just read about before. So with that, I'll begin with a couple of different quotes. You can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom. That was by Malcolm X. The battles that count aren't the ones for gold medals. The struggles within yourself, the invisible, inevitable battles inside all of us. That's where it's at. Jesse Owens. And lastly, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Booker T. Washington. And so I wanted to just kind of start this one off with an experience that I had in my early 20s, where I had found myself lost in a small town in Northern California and trying to find my way back, only to have been stopped by two police vehicles that had pulled up seemingly out of nowhere, with the men jumping out and immediately pointing their guns at me. And what that is really like is difficult to explain on so many levels, because I didn't really understand it myself. And it's only been years of contemplating and thinking and digging into the history that I really began to see the themes that are constant, not just back in the early or late 1800s, early 1900s, but things and themes that persist till this day. And so I wanted to read a couple of passages from prominent civil rights leaders early in its infancy. So this one is by Sojourner Truth. That man over there says women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And aren't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And aren't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And aren't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of them sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And then one by Ida B. Wells. The lynching record for a quarter of a century merits the thoughtful study of the American people. It presents three salient facts. First, lynching is a color line murder. Second, crimes against women is the excuse, not the cause. Third, it is a national crime and requires a national remedy. Proof that lynching follows the color line is found in the statistics which have been kept for the past 25 years. This was wholly political, its purpose being to suppress the colored vote by intimidation and murder. Thousands of assassins banded together under the name of the Ku Klux Klan's Midnight Riders, Knights of the Golden Circle, etc., etc. Spread a reign of terror by beating, shooting, and killing colored in the few years. The purpose was accomplished and the black vote was suppressed, but mob murder continued. From 1882, in which year 52 were lynched, down to the present. Lynching has been along the lines of color. Mob murder increased yearly until 1892. More than 200 victims were lynched. And statistics show that 3,284 men, women, and children have been put to death in this quarter of a century during the last 10 years, from 1899 to 1908. Inclusive, the number lynched was 959. Of this number, 102 were white, while the colored victims numbered 857. No other nation, civilized or savage, burns its criminals. Only under the stars and stripes is the human holocaust possible. 28 human beings burned at the stake, one of them a woman and two of them children, is the awful indictment against American civilization, the gruesome tribute which the nation pays to the color line. And so with those, I just ask you to turn off your cameras if you would like, to make sure you're muted, and we'll begin this session with a relaxation. And so find that nice place of comfort. And I know what I just said probably is not the most comfortable words to hear. And so for this one, just visualize yourself sitting in a beautiful field, perhaps, or maybe somewhere on a mountain, somewhere where there's lots of trees around, somewhere where you can feel the difference in the air, even smell the differences in the air, maybe even feel it as the humidity rises with the morning. And just watching and visualizing a leaf before you. Perhaps this is a small leaf, or maybe it's a much bigger leaf. But as you look at the leaf, just begin to watch how the droplets begin to form. At first, they are many droplets that begin to form all across the leaf. But as the droplets get heavier and heavier, they begin to slide down to the center of the leaf. And as they slide down to the center of the leaf, they begin to accumulate, becoming more formed, larger, and heavier. And maybe you can visualize that leaf feel heavier and heavier under the weight of the water. And as the leaf feels heavier and heavier, the water droplets begin to form an even bigger pool that slide down to the end of the leaf. And slowly, the water droplet falls off the edge of the leaf, and then the leaf springs upward. And now I bring this to your attention simply to demonstrate how heaviness can be all around us, how it begins first as a little droplet, and maybe those little droplets accumulate, become a bigger droplet. And maybe you feel that droplet. But now, perhaps as you feel the droplets, maybe weighing on your chest or back or even your shoulders or legs, maybe even noticing the heaviness in your legs. Just visualize yourself as that leaf, feeling that heaviness grow and grow. And then as it accumulates to the end of the leaf, letting go and feeling the heaviness subside. For some people, you might even feel as if you have suddenly grown weightless. Maybe you feel as if all the weight in the world has been lifted off your shoulders. Maybe you can feel more comfortable still, or even feel more relaxed. And the more you visualize this heaviness leaving that leaf, dipping down further and further, heavier and heavier, and then releasing and feeling all of the tension subside as this lightness forms. And as you feel the lightness, just begin to feel all of the muscles letting go. Feel all the muscle strands in your legs becoming soft, those in your arms becoming more relaxed. And even though you may feel very comfortable right now and feel very relaxed, your mind can still be just as alert as you need it to continue through the session. And we'll begin now. So it is now 1970. Slavery is ended only just. And Black folks are trying to figure out a way to coexist or even to simply survive in this new world. Some even preferring slavery over this newfound freedom, as with newfound freedom comes many other struggles. And it's not simply that being free gives you opportunities, but being free for the Black people showed them what opportunities they could not have, what lives were not theirs to live, what struggles would continue to be theirs to bear. In 1865, the Ku Klux Klan was born in Pulaski, Tennessee. And while the Ku Klux Klan had been officially dissolved in 1869, it continued underground after that. Intimidation, violence, and even the lynching of Black Southerners were not uncommon practices in the Jim Crow South. And not only that, but Blacks had to contend with a new adversary, laws that made them unaccepted, laws that were crafted to prevent, laws that were explicitly constructed to ensure that Blacks never got the same rights as the white folk. The legal system was stacked against Black citizens, with former Confederate soldiers working as police and judges, making it difficult for African Americans to win court cases and ensuring they were subject to Black codes. Black codes were strict local and state laws that detailed when, where, and how formerly enslaved people could work and for how much compensation. The codes appeared throughout the South as a legal way to put Black citizens into their indentured servitudes, to take voting rights away, and to control where they lived and how they traveled, and to seize children for labor purposes. Laws forbade African Americans from living in white neighborhoods, and Jim Crow began to rise. Segregation was enforced for public schools, phone booths, pools, hospitals, asylums, jails, and even residential homes for the elderly and the handicapped. Marriage and cohabitation between white and Black people was strictly forbidden in most Southern states. And this is the new world where you find yourself. And perhaps it was a dark night. Maybe it was one of those quiet nights, so quiet you could hear a pin drop, as the cliche goes. Yet maybe you were relaxed comfortably in your house, enjoying this newfound freedom in whatever ways you could, attempting to make a life for yourself and your family. But on that night, It was the screams on the other side of the road that took you out of that pleasant relaxation. And perhaps not knowing exactly what was occurring, maybe you grab your partner, maybe the kids, and go to the windows or doors to see what is happening. And as you look through the windows or door, or maybe even step out onto the lawn, it is quite clear that there is a cross burning in the yard opposite of yours. Now, what this cross means at the moment, no one really knew, and maybe they would never know. And it probably didn't really matter, because the cross was symbolic of something much greater anyways. Fear. They wanted you to feel fear. You, your neighbors, anyone in the proximity. And maybe this was accompanied by taking the people out of that house and dragging them off, as did happen throughout the Jim Crow South. Maybe the people were left fine and the cross as a warning. And maybe you now feel that you have to leave. You might feel that you're in danger. Of course, danger wasn't something that was so foreign, as you'd been in danger pretty much your entire life, with very little chances and opportunities to simply relax, always having to be thinking about what ifs and how can I's. And so maybe much of your life was wrought in fear. The fear of where you would find work, the fear of which communities would even have you, the fear of where you would buy your food and where your kids would go to school, even where you would go if you were injured, all completely subject to Jim Crow. And while there were laws to prevent physicians from helping Black folk, that doesn't mean that they were enforced. And this was the life that you'd come to understand, that you were meant to find your own way, all on your own, to figure out how to survive in this hostile world, which may even be more hostile than it was before, as now you're a threat, or at least perceived as a threat. Whenever you walk into town, you feel the eyes on your back. When you go to buy something from a store, you wonder if the cashier will refuse to even allow you to purchase those items. And all of these things culminate to the first African American to address these issues on a public stage in front of both Black and white people. On September 18, 1895, Booker T. Washington delivered his famous Atlanta Compromise speech at the opening of the Cotton States and International Exhibition in Atlanta. This was the first African American man ever to address a racially mixed Southern audience. And there are many others, Ida B. Wells among them. They began to take up a new standard of civil rights. And even though Blacks had won their freedom and even won the right to vote, how they were viewed in society left much to be desired. And so they fought. And maybe you fought too. Maybe you held up a sign, brandishing it high above your head, walking down the streets, forcing people to look at you, to read the words on your sign. And really all those words meant was, we want equality. But equality was something that would be difficult and not take place for many years. And even then, equality was fickle. And so they marched and fought and discussed and pleaded. But to find someone to take up the banner was difficult, and even more so an organization to support the advancement of colored people, which led to the establishment of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, more commonly known as the NAACP. And it formed in 1909 with the mission to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons and to eliminate racial hatred and racial discrimination. Now, with this organization, Black folks without educations can be represented. With this institution, Blacks were able to band together, fighting for the equality that they've sought for so long. And then the Great Migration. So even with the emancipation of the slaves, the South was hostile to Blacks. The Black codes and Jim Crow laws made it nearly impossible for a Black person to earn a living wage, lest they become an indentured servant once more, forced to work the fields, to pick the cotton, to clean the houses, and care for the white folk. And so the Great Migration began as Black people began to seek other opportunities, understanding that perhaps living in the Jim Crow South was not much better than slavery. And they began to leave in significant numbers. Thousands of African Americans left the South looking for better opportunities. They moved north to seek employment in the factories. They also migrated west, where new lands and new opportunities had become prominent in American culture. And this trend would persist from 1910 and wouldn't slow down into the 1960s. And so as Blacks began to migrate and integrate into other cities, to other places, they began to find new ways to deal with racism and the laws that had forced them into still a life of servitude. But there were opportunities. And even though it was rare, there were African American doctors, lawyers, and others. And even though many schools still segregated them, having classes of Black folks and some of white, there were still chances that a Black person could be educated at the doctoral level. But this would slow down a bit as tensions began to rise in Europe, with Germany beginning to raise their forces. And World War I would take off in 1918. And Du Bois called for all African Americans to serve in the World War I to help build a case for them to be treated equally. And even though Blacks have fought in every war prior and since, holding arms against the Brits in the Revolutionary War, standing with the North, and in some cases the South, during the Civil War, and still without the equality they've been asked to serve their country. But why would they? At a time where fear is rampaging their communities, at a time where they're not even seen as humans by many, let alone as equals. Yet despite this, and without any promise of any sort of recompense, more than 350,000 African Americans signed up to serve in World War I. Many were assigned menial roles due to American society's deep fears and prejudices that Blacks couldn't be trusted, that they were aggressive and violent. And despite facing racism at home and in uniform, tens of thousands of Black soldiers served courageously and capably in combat. And when the war broke out, Black Americans had this debate whether or not to support the war effort at all. Some questioned why they should help the US defend democracy overseas when they were denied its full benefits at home. And what would it be like for an African American to contemplate whether or not to serve their country for the sheer fact that their country did not even view them as equals? And so later in life, perhaps you stay home, unfit to go to war, and still trying to find your way in this new world. The younger Black men go off to war, and all you really have are the stories that you hear, the newspaper articles that you find. Maybe some of them tell the atrocities of war, but many of them don't even mention the thousands of Black men that were shipped off to France. Largely, they were ignored, not even detailing the devotion of these men in their service. 200,000 Black troops were shipped overseas. They were shipped overseas in segregated units. And most of these units were led by white officers because they didn't trust a Black man to lead a Black company. And so blacks rose up and protested the injustice of not simply being able to lead their own, but it seemed almost as if this were another branch of slavery. The black man with the white overlord leading soldiers into combat. And maybe many of those people wondered if this person leading them even cared if they died, even cared if they came home. And so as the protests grew, the army eventually trained over 1,300 black officers to lead these black companies. But others feared that black combat veterans would be emboldened to resist the racism when they returned home. So as a result, most African Americans were assigned to labor duties in the rear areas of the war. But still, many found themselves in battle. The Germans had even met several of these companies and nicknamed them the Harlem Hellfighters, because the regiment never lost a man through capture, lost a trench or a foot of ground to the enemy. The 369th Infantry was also the first to reach the Rhine River and provided the longest service of any regiment in a foreign army, as they were attached to the French army during this time. They fought in the trenches for 191 days, and the entire regiment received the Croix de Guerre medal for their actions in the war. And so maybe you read about these in newspapers. Maybe there was hope that upon their return, things would be different. Upon their return, there would be a level of respect for the sacrifices that they had made. Maybe you even read or heard stories like this one. We had no idea as to what we were going to experience. So naturally, most of us were in the boats. In my case, we were out in a small barge-like boat. When we landed on the shores of France, I had to guide my motorcycle through the waters up to the shore. And at that time, which was around the early part of the morning, around 1 or 2 a.m., the sky was lit up like broad daylight. There was so much going on about us, and all we could hear was bombs as the airplanes bombed all around the shore and even bombing other airplanes. As one example of a story you may have heard. But there were also other stories that would be brought back. And after the war ended, you may have found yourself hearing stories such as those about the Scotch. The Scotch people know that they can see something or touch something that's black at New Year's. That means an omen of good luck to them. And I remember one family living close to us that had red hair. They asked me to come to their house at 5 minutes past 12 on New Year's Eve, and they would appreciate it very much and had a cake at the door. And when we went there, my brother and I did. And from that time on, we heard various stories about where colored people had been welcomed in different homes of Scotch people after midnight to bring good luck to their homes. You had to be broad-minded to be receptive to it. In my case, I did not find it derogatory. As long as I brought good luck to them, why not? And then maybe you hear other stories about the return. But the war, you see, the war just threw the whole thing open. The war going on, you're out there with your buddy. He's got a rifle, you've got a rifle. You're both learning the same thing. You're defending the USA and that sort of thing. And then one day, the war is over and everybody's going back to Civilian Street, and you walk up the street with your jacket on, and you go in somewhere to have a drink with the buddy that you served with. And the guy at the door says, well, we don't ordinarily have people of color in here, and so forth. So maybe another persuasion for other people. And somebody met him, and they all stood up and said, oh, he was there training beside me the other day, but why does that matter? No colored people are allowed in here. We'll smash every damn thing here now. But then the soldier I fought with said, no, 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 no. He went and got the police and everything. The police said, well, these fellows have some uniforms and whatnot. They were in the service. What are you going to do? And so that was one benefit, if there were any benefits to the war. And so as these people return with their stories, with their experiences, you begin to hear other experiences that pique the mind. Maybe you hear of how Blacks are treated different in France. France had abolished slavery several decades before that of the US. And in France, Black people have a chance to be normal, a chance to feel like part of the community, a part of the culture and the people. And so when you have that taste of freedom, the freedom to be and do things without fear of dying, without fear of being lynched, a cross burning in your front yard, or anything of the sort, you get to enjoy life. And upon the end of the war, returning home was a culture shock. To be reminded of what it feels like to be oppressed. To be reminded that not everybody treats you as a human. To be reminded that in your own country, you are not wanted. You are disposable. And with these stories, they brought despair that they would return to this life, to figure out how to survive in this world. Yet there was hope. Hope that one day it could be a country like that. Hope that one day you would be perceived as equal as you were in another country. And so maybe that keeps you going. Despite the Jim Crow laws that still exist, even decades after their formation, and despite the formation of the NAACP, the courts will still not outlaw the Jim Crow laws of segregation and those of the Black codes meant to oppress Blacks. And so the oppression continues. And at one point in time, over 40% of all Black men in the state of Florida had been incarcerated and had a felony, limiting their ability to vote, limiting their ability to find work. And so the law helped to oppress the Black man, the Black woman, to make them feel ostracized, to deny them their right to vote. And many other states have equal laws where Blacks were incarcerated at a significant rate as a way for free labor to develop. Because even though slavery had been outlawed, you could have free labor through an inmate. And so they began to build prisons throughout the country. Prisons that would then be filled with people of color and other people that weren't wanted by society. And then they would be forced to work for days without wage, without hope of freedom. And perhaps the only thing they even did to land themselves there was to look at a white person the wrong way on the wrong day. And so even though slavery, now gone 40, 50 years in the past, this new form of slavery begins to grow through incarceration, through the actions of law enforcement, and tensions begin to grow as law enforcement and the Black communities collide. And while there's still hope that maybe one day this will all go away and you will be seen as equal, each day is still struggle. And even then, walking into a store will get you a look. And maybe even more. And now, Black folk begin to find new ways to fight, even developing their own communities, developing their own cities. If they can't live with them, they'll live by themselves. And so many prominent Black communities begin to establish. Communities like Rosewood and Greenwood began to flourish. Greenwood, known as the Black Wall Street. As Blacks begin to accumulate wealth, able to afford the things they need, working in communities that thrived, and creating the lives that they hoped they would have. And despite Black folks trying to get away, to find their own little niche in this country, tensions were still on the rise. The KKK began to thrive in the South and even throughout other parts of the United States. And as Blacks began to become more self-sufficient, it became clear that this self-sufficiency was not what some wanted. It was not what some would stand for. And in the years to come, there would be violence and unrest, and an even greater fight to be equal. He who is not courageous enough to take risks will accomplish nothing in life. Muhammad Ali. And there are two ways of exerting one's strength. One is pushing down, and the other is pulling up. Booker T. Washington. History has shown that courage can be contagious and hope can take on a life of its own. Michelle Obama. And so now you can begin to notice the body once more, beginning with the feet, just feeling the toes, wiggling them slightly, waking the feet up. Then you can just travel along your legs to the ankle, the knee, the thigh, the waist, feeling all the muscles, and then up through the torso, noticing the breath, perhaps even noticing your diaphragm as it rises and falls, feeling down to the tips of your fingers, wiggling the fingers to wake them up. And then feeling the head as the breath rushes in through the nose or mouth and exits. And when you are ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you all again for joining me on this journey. It's my pleasure to get to do this, and I truly hope that you had an experience that is ineffable. That is, it is difficult to put into words what you just experienced. And maybe it gave you a different perspective, if even for a moment, a different way to view society